SUB2r camera firmware is upgradable via USB. Upgrades deliver fixes, improvements, and new features. To find out what is the current version of the firmware loaded on the camera, go to Device tab on the SUB2r Control Center and look for the Firmware version info section. It will provide information on the firmware currently installed on FX3 and FPGA. In this case, the firmware version is 1.1.4.3.44 for FX3 and 1.1.4.3.60 for FPGA. To upgrade firmware, go to Tools, Firmware Upgrade. Firmware Upgrade for FX3 and FPGA screen provides information on the current version of the firmware, source file to download, in this case it is alpha, version of the file to download, for example V45 evaluation, file name, and button to execute FX3 firmware upgrade. Similar to FX3, FPGA side has the same information and control for the FPGA: current version installed, source file location, type of source file, file name, and button to execute FPGA upgrade. Source file can be loaded on the client side and installed. This option is useful for either offline firmware upgrade or to load a custom-made FX3 image or FPGA bin file. Let's start with the FX3 upgrade. Current version of FX3 installed is 1.1.4.3.44, V.44, and we want to upgrade it to the latest available. In this case, it's V.45. Those numbers are last digits of the firmware version identifier. By default, most up-to-date version of the firmware is listed at the top of the drop-down section. Very important note: under no circumstances should you unplug the SUB2r camera from the USB during the firmware upgrade, or interrupt the process of firmware upgrade. Doing so will reset its firmware to unpredictable state. We will review the recovery process at a later time. Now we are ready to proceed. Click on the Upgrade FX3 Firmware button. Firmware Upgrade Monitor screen will provide real-time update on the firmware progress upgrade. Wait until all stages of the upgrade are completed. The progress bar is completely filled in green color. A new version of FX3 firmware is listed. In our case, it's version 1.1.4.3.45. Dismiss Firmware Upgrade Monitor and Firmware Upgrade for FX3 and FPGA screens. SUB2r Control Center will automatically refresh the current version of the FX3 from prior 1.1.4.3.44 version to a newly loaded 1.5.4.3.45. FX3 has been successfully upgraded to a new version. If there is a need to upgrade current version of the previous version of the firmware, follow the same steps and select the version you need from the load drop-down. For example, V.44 evaluation. Follow the steps until downgrade is successfully completed. FPGA firmware upgrade follows the very same protocol. However, there is a rule. To downgrade or upgrade the FPGA, FX3 firmware version has to be the most current. Once FPGA is upgraded or downgraded to a desired version, FX3 code can now also be downgraded to a version required. Here is an example. Current FX3 code is version 44, which is lower than the most up-to-date version 45. Attempting to upgrade or downgrade FPGA code will result in an error. We need to first upgrade FX3 to the up-to-date version 45, and then downgrade FPGA to version 59. Note: it is advised to close both Firmware Upgrade Monitor and Firmware Upgrade for FX3 and FPGA screens to let SUB2r Control Center update the current version of the firmware after upgrading FX3 prior to FPGA upgrade. Now it is safe to either downgrade or upgrade FPGA to a desired firmware version. But what if firmware upgrade did not go as smoothly as we hoped for, and there are issues that have prevented a successful completion of the upgrade? No worries, we have you covered. We have implemented defensive measures to recover from the firmware upgrade failures. In the first example, we will recover from the FPGA firmware upgrade failure. Here are the steps to follow. Close all screens and instances of SUB2r Control Center and disconnect the camera. Make sure to completely power cycle SUB2r camera. This means unplugging USB as well as an auxiliary power cable. Reconnect SUB2r camera and launch SUB2r Control Center. Notice that the current version of FPGA listed is 1.1.4.3.55. This is so-called golden image. It is not the best image. This is a baseline version of the FPGA firmware from which user can upgrade to any versions required. Before we proceed with the FPGA upgrade, we need to reset Fx3 chip first. You can either do this from the back of the camera by pressing a reset button using a paper clip. Be gentle, no need to pound on it. Or go to the Expert tab, select FPGA console, select Fx3 reset from the drop-down list, and click on Run button. Dismiss the FPGA console screen and relaunch SUB2r Control Center. Go to Firmware Upgrade for Fx3 and FPGA screen and start FPGA firmware upgrade. Wait until upgrade is finished. Close Firmware Upgrade Monitor and Firmware Upgrade for Fx3 and FPGA screens for version of the FPGA firmware to be automatically updated on the Firmware Version Info section. You have successfully recovered from the FPGA firmware upgrade failure. In the next example, we will recover from the Fx3 firmware upgrade failure. Here are the steps to follow. Close all screens and instances of SUB2r Control Center and disconnect the camera. Make sure to completely power cycle SUB2r camera. This means unplugging USB as well as auxiliary power cable. Reconnect SUB2r camera. Note: in Windows Device Manager, in the USB controllers list, you will find a West branch entry. This means Fx3 needs to be programmed with an image file. To get to the Windows Device Manager, right-click on the Start icon of Windows 10 and select Device Manager from the list. Go to wiki.sub2r and download the following: SUB2r Update Utility Program. This is additional software designed specifically for Fx3 initial programming. And most recent offline version of the Fx3 image file. Launch SUB2r Update Utility Program. Click on Program Fx3 SPI Flash button and select an offline image file downloaded from wiki.sub2r.com. Wait for the programming to complete and dismiss SUB2r Update Utility Program. Launch SUB2r Control Center. Firmware Version Info should now list the new file we just loaded on the Fx3. To confirm successful recovery, go to Windows Device Manager and review USB controllers list. SUB2r USB camera is present in the USB controllers list and ready to be used. We have successfully recovered from the Fx3 firmware upgrade failure.